let's talk a little bit about butterfat. Okay, we've probably got another 20 minutes, guys, to go through here because I think this becomes a very topical issue at this time of year. And I guess what we regularly see on a lot of farms is what we call the Butterfat Bus Crash, where we've been trucking along pretty well through autumn with butterfat, but suddenly we're starting to see a fair bit of new pasture come into diet. People might be running a little bit short on silage. We've been feeding a fairly high level of concentrate and haven't put a lot of thought into that. And what we'll often see are things cruising along pretty nicely at around the sort of 3.5%, 4.1%. Then we get this sudden drop down into the around 3%. And in some situations, and this particular farm was a Hunter Valley farm a few years ago, where it was a strongly wheat-based concentrate. They hit July and they were hitting butterfats of around 2.5%, which is obviously financially problematic, but it may also reflect that there could be some significant problems going on with these cows. So I guess it's very commonly seen when we're chasing milk, when we're starting to feed these new pastures, when we're feeding a fair bit of concentrate. And again, we haven't necessarily put a lot of thought into that concentrate or how we're actually managing our pasture situation. I guess it's worth just going over the real basics about where milk fat actually comes from a metabolic perspective, because I think there's value in understanding this rather than just telling you what to do. Okay, so we do see butterfat coming from the breakdown of body tissue and fat, and this is why we can often see when cows are being a little bit underfed at times. We can actually see in fresh herds that are getting underfed total dry matter, when they're breaking down a lot of body tissue, we can actually see some increase in butterfat in that time, because the body is a source of fat for milk production. However, most of what we're chasing is liver synthesized, or is made in the liver from utilisation of volatile fatty acids that are produced by fermentation in the rumen. And we talk about the production particularly of acetate, which is a production of volatile fatty acid that's produced from the fermentation of fibre. And also increasingly there's interest in butyrate, some of which comes from fibre, but also some which is actually coming from the breakdown of sugars in the diet. And then if we're feeding fats directly, we can absorb some of those fats, bypass fats, and some of the fats that are in grasses and in other components. Those fats can also be directly absorbed in the intestines, and they can contribute to milk fat as well. Okay, so look, a really quick and dirty look at basic rumen function. And again, we don't, if anyone wants to see more of this, they're very welcome to join in the Advanced Nutrition in Action program that we're going to be running in the Mid-North Coast and Hunter regions in the spring this year. We've just started down in Bega, and we've had a pretty good roll-up in our first session there, and we'll talk a lot more about this stuff in detail in those courses. However, look, what we know is that the carbohydrates such as cell wall fibre and sugars come into the rumen. These are fermented, okay, and they produce what we call these volatile fatty acids. The acetate and the butyrate fractions, they go in through the rumen wall, synthesised in the liver to produce butterfat in particular. Propionate, that's often produced from the breakdown of starches in particular. Okay, it goes into the liver and it produces sugars, so glucose, and eventually milk lactose as well. So if we have diets that are low in fibre, we can produce less acetate. So that can lead to less butterfat. If we have a low pH environment in the rumen, so an acid rumen, that'll inhibit the bacteria that actually produce acetate. So once again, we have less acetate produced, less absorbed, less fat being synthesised. If we have low sugars in the diet, that can impact butyrate in the diet. Okay, and that we know now is starting to feed into butterfat. And this is why we're increasingly looking at sugars in diets, things like molasses and other sugar sources are showing increased, I guess, usefulness in your area in particular, with supporting both at sometimes butterfat production, but also milk protein production as well. Low starch diets tend to lead to low propionate diets. They've got less glucose and less lactose. Lactose is the sugar that's in milk, and that milk sugar is very important in driving milk volume. If we have low sugars and starch, we also grow less bugs. If we have less bugs, there's less protein from those bugs that spills over, okay, into the intestine. So we have less protein available for milk production as well. Similarly, if we lack both degradable and undegradable protein in the diet, we have less protein available for milk production as well. So that's rumen function in 30 seconds or 1 minute. Again, we can talk a lot more about that another day, but we won't get too hung up on that now. But it's important, I guess, when we're starting to troubleshoot what might be going wrong with milk components, that we develop better understanding on these areas. Okay, so look, I read a really interesting book a few years ago. I don't do much in the line of self-help books, but the book was called Why People Fail. Okay, most of the self-help books are all about how I succeeded and how I was the most awesome. This guy had a really good look at what commonly leads people to fail, and understanding the processes of where things go wrong, I think is a really good way of hopefully getting things to start going right. So I turned this around and I said, well, here's my 10 tips for actually causing butterfat depression. So if you want to cause butterfat depression, this is what you do. Firstly, you graze well fertilised 1 and 2 leaf ryegrass and clover on a very short rotation. Secondly, you feed more than 8 kilos dry matter of this pasture with not a lot of other forage supporting the diet. Secondly, you're feeding more than 7 to 8 kilograms of concentrate through the dairy. Thirdly, that concentrate is heavily based on wheat or triticale or wheat and triticale products, and that's often over-processed. Fifthly, we have restricted access to the herd for palatable fibre and good long fibre that the cows actually want to eat. Sixthly, we have poor buffering in our diets. We don't address buffering. If we're using TMRs and we want to cause low butterfat, we over-process our chop. If we have a high percentage of North American Holsteins in our herd, okay, it's going to exacerbate all of these other issues. If you're feeding excessive rates of monensin, it can worsen the situation as well. And some other specific sources of vegetable oils, such as canola oil, and this is where we can have problems when cattle are getting fed canola on pasture that has been mechanically pressed rather than chemically pressed. Okay, we can see that exacerbating some of our issues with butterfat depression. So basically, that is the recipe, guys. If you want to cause butterfat problems, this is what we do. Okay, we do all of this together. Interestingly, okay, all of these in isolation can be managed, okay, or in combination. We've got some very good butterfat production in high percentage North American Holstein herds, but if you combine that with these other risk factors, we're going to lead to having issues. But I guess if we understand these things that cause butterfat depression, we're in a better position then to flip that on its head and say, well, what do we do to prevent it? Okay. We've traditionally perceived our issues in butterfat in the winter of being around acidosis with high grain diets, not enough fibre, high production, and that Holstein problem. That's where we can see manures like this, or manure like this. Both of these typically are what we see at that time of year. I guess we've got this increased understanding, though, that it's not just the acidosis issue that's important. Probably it is the major driver of butterfat depression in grazing cows is a combination of specific fatty acids, what we call polyunsaturated fatty acids in the rumen, and the disruption of their normal rumen metabolism. Okay, so there's PUFA metabolism, or we'll call it PUFAs for short. Okay, PUFAs are not perfectly normal in pastures, polyunsaturated fatty acids, but if they're in very high levels, okay, which they are in short winter ryegrass, or if our rumen function is disrupted, we get problems occurring of how these PUFAs are broken down in the rumen. Okay, they need to go through a process called biohydrogenation, okay, which actually changes the structure of those fatty acids into a form where it doesn't depress butterfat. But if that biohydrogenation is disrupted and it doesn't occur as it should, some of these fatty acids will directly depress milk fat production. This process is disrupted when we see low rumen pHs, very rapid flow of feed out of the rumen. And when that occurs, we see more of these partially dehydrogenated or not dehydrogenated fatty acids escape into the intestines. Without boring you with their specific names, which are there in the presentation, if we see lots of that overflowing into the intestine, we can see an up to a 25% reduction in milk fat production. And that's been proven now with some really interesting research in the States where these fatty acids have been harvested, infused directly into the intestines, and then these drops from butterfat percentages of 4 to in the mid-2s have been documented. Again, this chart tells us basically the same thing, and it's there probably more for reference. But again, if we have messed up rumen fermentation, these dietary polyunsaturated fatty acids are then passed through the rumen into the intestines, where they then actively will depress milk fat as we move forward. So what do we know about winter grasses? And again, this is some early spring samples, some of these from your areas. The fat percentages can get exceptionally high, you know, up over 5% is very, very common. At the same time of year, we know that fibre levels in pasture, and again, this is some data collected in your area as well, in predominantly in winter, but also in spring in the Riverina, where the fibre levels in the grass that was actually grazing got exceptionally low. So critically, what we need to think about with managing butterfat at this time of year is that pasture is actually a big part of our problem. Acidosis may be partially involved with this, and if it is present as well, it'll worsen the issue. The big deal is disrupted biohydrogenation of pasture fats. And to minimise the effect of these pasture fats, it all feeds back to our pasture management, we actually need to let our grass grow. Okay, we need to get up above our 2 leaves, if possible, and then we'll have our fibre hopefully in the paddock. We know then that the fat content also drops and the composition improves, and we end up with a bit more fibrous pastures. If cattle are over-allocated feed and they can pick the eyes out of it, we can have problems again compounding the situation. We need to maintain our fibre in the diet if pastures are short. And again, we need to minimise our rumen pH depression with slow fermenting grains such as corn and barley, and avoiding wheat and triticale at this time is really, really important. Okay, so our key messages are that we need to reduce the concentrate allocation sometimes, particularly if we've got plenty of pasture available. Sometimes we need to pull that grain back and substitute it with more pasture. And that makes sense if it's available and it's not going to impact our margins. If we're feeding lots of silage, particularly maize silage, bicarb can be very important in these diets. Don't overdo your rumensin. It can still be there, but don't overdo it. Palatable hay that all cattle can access can be really, really important as well. Critically, butterfat can be managed in all breeds, but it doesn't mean you need to go and have a paddock or a farm of crossbreds because you've got a butterfat problem. Any questions, guys? Because there's a lot there, and I know that we've had a few people drop off for varying reasons, but are there any questions on that, and particularly from, I guess, Luke and Tim, the farmers in the group?
Yeah, Neil, I guess, as I spoke to you yesterday, that dropping the protein meals in and out as you go onto your ryegrass, and, you know, what are the critical signs when you should and shouldn't do it? You know, is there a golden rule when the percentage drops to 3.5 or so? Or
Look, I think, Luke, we've got to be really focused on that decision. It's a great question on what are the complementary feeds in the diet, and what are you trying to achieve with that protein in the diet. You know, in your situation, you know, where there's still a fair bit of low protein silage in the diet, I guess we can still have a pretty good milk protein, but if we pull too much protein out, we're actually going to start turning down milk production itself. I guess once we're getting up around 8 to 10 kilos plus of pasture in the diet, I think at that stage we can really start to wind back the canola meal on most farms. Okay, if you're getting up around 12 or 14 kilos of grass, it's going to be a very marginal response in most farms. There'll be a few situations where they might be different to that additional protein over and above probably bringing in, you know, another kilo of a slow fermenting carbohydrate, which will cost less, like maybe another kilo of maize or another kilo of barley into that situation. So, Luke, I think it's important to not just look at your test percent, but to look at your yield of protein, because that's ultimately what you're getting paid for. So if we pull back on that canola meal and your kilos of protein being shipped every day isn't moving, then we're probably in a better place because we'll be saving money, okay? And it's probably going to be accompanied by some improvements in fat yield as well. So look, milk protein, much less an issue generally at this time of year. Where we're probably seeing most of our milk production or issues associated with milk protein is in herds which have lost a lot of body condition. Okay, so cows that lose body condition, you know, and aren't getting fed enough are the ones which, when we start feeding them again, actually go through a phase of putting more muscle back on and more condition on. And it's not till we get that body condition back onto these cows that we can expect to get really good milk protein production. So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. Okay, so as we start getting better feed in front of the cows and the condition score starts to improve, our overall milk protein levels are likely to improve in general. And again, as we mentioned to Luke before, don't be just focused on percent, be more focused on your kilograms of protein being shipped. Because as your volume goes up, you know, we might go up 3, 4, 5 litres, which might be a 10, 15, 20% increase in milk production at this time of year, which we'll often see. If your proteins come back by 0.1 or 0.2, that might only represent a drop in protein test of 3 or 4%. Okay, so what we're losing perhaps on test percentage, we're picking up on yield, and that's our important thing to be focused on. So look, I guess, chronic underfeeding or long-term damage from things like drought or flood can be major issues of milk protein production, and the core drivers on milk protein in most situations are cows in good nick, and are they being fully fed? Okay. Now, one of the interesting things, again, we're seeing this year, we've got a number of herds running much higher milk proteins than normal. We're seeing some association with this, with feeding some of these higher sugared supplements, 1 to 2 kilos of either molasses in those diets, or looking down this way with some of the candy wastes that are coming through the situation and lolly waste. They're actually making quite a big difference, we think, in the milk protein production on these farms. That's generally, I guess, we think from actually driving more bug production and more bacterial protein production in those diets.